Most people hear the phrase Marine Division and picture a single battlefield formation, thousands of troops, heavy equipment, and a clear place in the American military hierarchy. But the real story is more complex. A Marine Division is not just a block of infantry, it is one layer inside a larger expeditionary system built to move quickly, fight in austere conditions, and integrate with aviation, logistics, and naval power on short notice. That difference matters because the Marine Corps is designed around readiness, not just size. Its divisions are meant to plug into Marine Expeditionary Forces, where ground units operate alongside aircraft, sustainment networks, intelligence elements, and command structures. In practice, that means a division is not judged only by how many Marines it contains. It is judged by where it is based, how fast it can deploy, what region it covers, and how well it connects to the rest of the force. Public perception often flattens these formations into history book labels: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Fallujah. Those battles matter, and each division carries the weight of them. But today, the more important question is how these organizations actually function inside a modern force built for rapid crisis response, deterrence, and expeditionary warfare. Some divisions are active duty spearheads tied to major Marine expeditionary forces. One is permanently positioned forward in the Pacific. Another exists as a reserve structure spread across the United States, built to reinforce active formations when a larger contingency demands it. Others belong mostly to history, remembered for decisive wartime campaigns before being deactivated. So to understand the Marine divisions, the starting point is not mythology. It is organizational design. And that means first looking at the basic split between active combat formations, forward deployed posture, and reserve reinforcement. To understand how Marine divisions work, the first step is to separate the Corps into two very different categories of combat power: active duty divisions built for immediate use, and the reserve division built for expansion. On paper, they all carry the same institutional identity. In practice, they serve different timelines, different readiness standards, and different strategic purposes. The active structure centers on three divisions. The 1st Marine Division is based at Camp Pendleton in California and sits inside a Marine Expeditionary Force. The 2nd Marine Division is based primarily at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina and belongs to 2 Marine Expeditionary Force. The 3rd Marine Division is tied to the 3 Marine Expeditionary Force and remains oriented toward the Indo-Pacific, with a structure linked closely to Okinawa and other positions in the region. Together, these formations give the Marine Corps a standing ground combat backbone on both coasts of the United States and inside the Pacific theater. Then there is the 4th Marine Division, the Reserve Division. It is not concentrated in one place like the active formations. Its units are distributed across multiple states, drawing personnel who train part-time but can be mobilized for larger national requirements. That makes it less about immediate first response and more about strategic depth. It exists to reinforce, backfill, and scale Marine combat power when the crisis is too large for the active force alone. This split reflects a broader design logic inside the Corps. The Marine Corps is smaller than the Army and does not try to mirror the Army's mass. Instead, it keeps a limited number of active divisions at higher readiness and relies on reserves when the mission expands beyond the initial surge. In other words, Marine divisions are not meant to provide endless volume. They are meant to provide fast, organized, integrated combat power at the opening stage of a conflict or contingency. That creates an important consequence. Once the Corps decides which divisions stay active, the next question becomes how those formations are internally built. Because a division is not just a headquarters with infantry underneath it. It is a layered structure with regiments, artillery, reconnaissance, engineers, and command elements that allow it to operate as a coherent fighting system. A Marine division sounds like a single combat unit, but in practice it operates more like a layered framework. To understand its real capabilities, it is necessary to look below the division headquarters and into the components that make it usable in combat. What appears from a distance to be one formation is actually a system of regiments, battalions, support elements, and command nodes designed to fight as a coordinated whole. At the center is the division headquarters. This is the command structure that sets priorities, assigns missions, manages intelligence flow, and coordinates the movement of subordinate units. It is not simply an administrative office. In combat, the headquarters functions as the brain of the formation, linking frontline maneuver units to artillery support, reconnaissance feeds, logistics requests, and higher-level Marine Expeditionary Force direction. Below that level sit the infantry regiments, which provide the division's main ground combat strength. These regiments are built from battalions, and those battalions are the formations most directly associated with closing with and maneuvering against an adversary. But infantry alone is not enough. A division also depends on artillery regiments or battalions for fire support, reconnaissance units to locate threats and shape decision-making, combat engineers to breach obstacles and improve mobility, and communications elements to keep the force connected under pressure. That internal mix is what gives a Marine division flexibility. A regiment may conduct the visible part of an operation, but it moves with support from multiple unseen layers. Reconnaissance helps identify where resistance is strongest. Engineers reduce the physical barriers that would slow an advance. Artillery extends reach beyond line of sight. The headquarters turns all of those moving parts into one operational picture. This model was visible in major campaigns across Marine Corps history. The famous infantry assault usually gets the attention, but the real mechanism was always broader: command, fires, mobility, and maneuver working in sequence. That is what transforms a collection of Marines into a division-level fighting force. But structure on paper is only the beginning. The next question is how these units are positioned geographically to respond when a crisis actually begins. Where a Marine division is based is not just a matter of geography. It determines response time, training environment, regional focus, and the political logic of U.S. force posture. Marine divisions are positioned to support a global expeditionary model, which means their locations are chosen less for domestic convenience and more for access to strategic theaters. The 1st Marine Division, anchored at Camp Pendleton on the West Coast, is naturally aligned with the Pacific and with rapid access to naval embarkation routes. Its location supports large-scale training in California and the southwestern United States, while keeping it connected to the broader operational demands of Marine Expeditionary Force. That makes it a key formation for deployments that require speed, amphibious integration, and movement across the Pacific. 2nd Marine Division, centered at Camp Lejeune on the East Coast, serves a different geographic logic. From there, it can support operations tied to the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and contingency requirements connected to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Its position also places it close to major East Coast logistics networks, ports, and training ranges, which matters when a division has to prepare for deployment as part of a larger Marine Air-Ground Task Force. The 3rd Marine Division has historically represented the clearest example of forward positioning. Its long-standing association with Okinawa and the broader Indo-Pacific reflects a strategic choice to keep Marine ground combat power closer to likely flashpoints in Asia. Forward presence reduces deployment time, signals commitment to allies, and gives the Marine Corps a standing role in regional deterrence rather than a purely reactive one. This geographic spread creates a layered posture: one division oriented westward, one eastward, and one already tied into the Pacific front line. The Reserve Division adds depth from across the United States when a crisis grows beyond the active force's opening capacity. In other words, Marine divisions are not placed randomly. They are distributed to shorten decision-to-action time across multiple theaters. But location alone does not create readiness. To make that posture credible, the Corps has to sustain a training system that turns these formations from stationed units into deployable combat organizations. A Marine division does not become effective simply because it exists on an organizational chart. Its real value depends on readiness, and readiness is built through an unusually demanding training cycle. To understand how these divisions function, it is necessary to look at how the Corps prepares units not just to fight, but to deploy fast, integrate with other elements, and operate with limited margin for error. Training begins at the small unit level. Infantry battalions, artillery batteries, reconnaissance teams, engineers, and headquarters elements all develop their own technical competence first. Marines practice individual skills, then squad and platoon drills, then company and battalion exercises. This progression matters because division-level performance depends on lower formations being able to execute tasks without constant supervision once operations begin. From there, the Corps expands outward into combined training. Infantry units do not train in isolation forever. They work with artillery for fire support coordination, with engineers for breaching and mobility, with communications teams to maintain battlefield connectivity, and with aviation elements when operating inside a larger Marine Air-Ground Task Force. The point is not just repetition, it is integration. A division has to function as a system before it ever reaches a real theater. Large training events make this visible. West Coast and East Coast formations use major ranges to rehearse live fire maneuvers, command post operations, amphibious links, and sustainment under pressure. For forward and oriented units, exercises in the Indo-Pacific add another layer by testing how forces move across islands, ports, airfields, in allied territories. These events reveal whether a division can translate doctrine into practice when terrain, distance, and timing start working against it. History has repeatedly shown why this matters. The Marine Corps has often been asked to respond in compressed timelines, whether in major wars or sudden contingencies. That requires units that are not only combat capable, but already accustomed to operating together before deployment begins. Readiness, in other words, is institutionalized long before the first order is given. But training alone does not move a division into action. For that, the Corps needs a command structure that can turn prepared units into a coordinated operational force. Training produces capability, but command turns capability into action. A Marine division can contain thousands of Marines and multiple subordinate units, yet none of that matters unless there is a system that directs them with speed and clarity. To understand how a division actually functions, it is necessary to examine the chain of command that connects national decisions to battlefield execution. At the top, Marine divisions operate inside a larger institutional hierarchy. They belong to Marine Expeditionary Forces, which serve as the Corps' principal warfighting commands. That means a division does not usually fight alone as an independent military universe. It receives direction from higher headquarters that coordinate ground, aviation, logistics, intelligence, and regional priorities. The division commander controls the formation, but that commander is also part of a much larger operational framework. Inside the division, command flows downward through regimental and battalion levels. Orders are translated from broad objectives into specific assignments. Which unit secures terrain, which element provides fire support, which road is used for movement, which reserve is held back, and which supporting assets are attached. This structure allows decisions to move from strategy to execution without every detail being improvised at the front. But the modern command system is not only hierarchical, it also depends on constant information flow. Intelligence reporting, communications networks, liaison officers, and digital systems help commanders update plans as conditions change. A division headquarters must absorb reconnaissance, track logistics, coordinate fires, and maintain contact with adjacent units, all while staying aligned with the higher command's intent. In practice, this makes command less like issuing one fixed order and more like continuously adjusting a moving machine. Historical combat has repeatedly shown the importance of this structure. When Marine formations have operated effectively in large campaigns, it has usually been because command relationships were clear enough to synchronize infantry, artillery, engineers, and supporting assets under pressure. Without that coherence, even well-trained units become fragmented. And once command is established, the next challenge becomes movement and sustainment. Because a division that cannot be supplied, transported, and maintained cannot remain effective for long. Combat formations are often judged by their visible strength: infantry numbers, vehicles, artillery, and firepower. But for a Marine division, the more important question is whether that force can actually move, sustain itself, and remain in the field once operations begin. This is where logistics becomes decisive. A division is only as effective as the supply system behind it. Marine divisions are designed for expeditionary warfare, which means they must be able to deploy away from permanent infrastructure and operate with a relatively lean footprint compared with larger land forces. That creates a logistical challenge from the start. Fuel, ammunition, food, water, medical support, spare parts, communications equipment, and transportation assets all have to arrive in the right place, in sequence, and under conditions that may be unstable or contested. This is why a division does not exist in isolation. It relies on the wider Marine air-ground task force structure, especially the logistics combat element, to keep the force functioning. Infantry battalions may conduct the mission the public sees, but behind them is a sustainment architecture handling convoy movement, maintenance, engineering support, medical evacuation, distribution points, and equipment repair. Without that system, operational tempo collapses quickly. The Marine Corps' history repeatedly illustrates this point. Amphibious campaigns in the Pacific required the movement of men and material across enormous distances, often onto islands with little usable infrastructure. Later operations in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated the same principle in a different form. Combat power had to be fed through long supply chains, with maintenance and resupply shaping what units could realistically do over time. In each case, success depended not only on tactical performance, but on whether sustainment systems could keep up with operational demands. This logistical reality also explains why divisions are so closely tied to naval and expeditionary mobility. They must be able to embark, deploy, unload, establish support networks, and then continue operating without the assumption of a stable rear area. In other words, movement and sustainment are not support functions sitting outside the fight. They are part of the fight, and once a division can move and sustain itself, the next layer to examine is how it extends its reach through firepower and supporting arms. A Marine division is often associated with infantry, but infantry alone does not explain how the formation gains tactical advantage. Its real reach comes from the supporting arms that expand what ground units can see, hit, and control. To understand how a division fights, it is necessary to examine the firepower architecture behind the maneuver force. The most direct layer is artillery. Marine artillery units provide indirect fire that can strike beyond line of sight, suppress defended positions, disrupt movement, and shape the battlefield before infantry closes in. This is not simply about destruction. It is about timing and coordination. Effective artillery allows commanders to isolate an objective, protect advancing units, and force an adversary to react under pressure rather than on its own terms. But fire support is broader than tube artillery alone. Mortars at lower echelons, rockets in joint or attached contexts, naval gunfire in some expeditionary scenarios, and air-delivered fires from Marine or joint aircraft all contribute to the division's overall striking power. The headquarters has to synchronize these assets carefully so that fires support maneuver without creating confusion, delay, or risk to friendly forces. In practice, that turns firepower into a command problem as much as a weapons problem. Historical operations show how decisive that coordination can be. In large amphibious assaults, preparatory fires were used to weaken defenses before landing forces pushed inland. In later land campaigns, artillery and aviation were combined to support urban operations, counter-mobility efforts, and rapid changes in tempo. The lesson remained consistent. The division that can integrate fires with movement gains options the infantry alone does not have. This fire support system also reflects the Marine Corps' expeditionary identity. Because divisions may operate from ships, austere bases, or dispersed positions, their supporting arms have to be flexible and responsive rather than fixed in one model. Firepower must travel with the force and adapt to changing terrain, distance, and access. That increases reach, but it also raises a new requirement. To use fires effectively, the division first has to know where to look, what to prioritize, and how to understand the battlefield in real time. That is where reconnaissance and intelligence become indispensable. Firepower only works when commanders know where to apply it. That is why reconnaissance and intelligence sit at the center of how a Marine division actually operates. From the outside, these functions can look secondary compared with infantry assaults or artillery strikes. In reality, they are what allow the division to make informed decisions before committing forces exposing gaps or wasting time against the wrong objective. At the tactical level, reconnaissance units help commanders understand terrain, routes, obstacles, and enemy positioning before larger formations move. Their job is not simply to observe. It is to reduce uncertainty. By identifying avenues of approach, defended areas, choke points, or potential landing zones, reconnaissance shapes how the rest of the division is used. That gives decision makers a clearer basis for assigning missions, sequencing fires, and choosing where risk is acceptable. Intelligence broadens that picture further. A division headquarters collects information from reconnaissance patrols, surveillance systems, higher command, adjacent units, and joint partners, then turns those inputs into an operational assessment. This process helps answer the questions that drive every campaign. What is the adversary trying to protect? Where is it vulnerable? How quickly can it move? And what actions are likely next? In other words, intelligence transforms scattered observations into usable direction. Marine operations across different eras show the same pattern. In amphibious warfare, commanders need a detailed knowledge of beaches, fortifications, and inland terrain before landing forces could be committed effectively. In later expeditionary and counterinsurgency campaigns, intelligence became even more continuous, tracking movement patterns, support networks, and local conditions that conventional maps could not explain by themselves. The methods evolved, but the purpose stayed the same: reduce ambiguity before committing combat power. This makes reconnaissance and intelligence more than a support activity. They are a control mechanism for the entire division. Good information helps preserve tempo, conserve resources, and prevent tactical surprise. Poor information does the opposite, no matter how capable the force appears on paper. And once the division can see the battlefield more clearly, the next question is how it connects to the wider marine system around it. Because a division reaches full effect only when it is integrated with aviation, logistics, and joint support beyond its own boundaries. A marine division is powerful on its own, but it is not designed to be self-sufficient in every dimension of war. Its real strength emerges when it is combined with the rest of the Marine Air-Ground Task Force. This is one of the most important features of how the Marine Corps operates. Divisions are built to fight as the ground combat element inside a larger, integrated system, rather than as isolated land formations. That system matters because ground units rarely operate alone in modern expeditionary warfare. A division depends on aviation for transport, close air support, reconnaissance, and casualty evacuation. It depends on logistics elements for sustainment, engineering support, and equipment recovery. It also relies on command and control networks that connect the ground fight to higher headquarters, naval forces, and joint partners. In effect, the division provides a central ground maneuver capacity, but the larger task force gives it reach, endurance, and flexibility. This integration changes how Marine divisions are used. Instead of being treated simply as mass infantry formations, they become components of a combined arms architecture. A battalion may seize terrain, but helicopters can reposition forces, fixed-wing aircraft can strike targets ahead of the advance, and logistics elements can keep the tempo going after the first contact. The battlefield effect comes from synchronizing these pieces rather than maximizing any one of them in isolation. The Marine Corps has repeatedly relied on this model because it suits expeditionary operations. Amphibious campaigns required close coordination between naval movement, air cover, shore assault forces, and follow-on sustainment. Later operations on land still followed the same principle, with divisions depending on aviation and support elements to maintain pressure across larger and more complex operating environments. The names of the tools changed, but the logic did not. This is why a Marine division should not be understood only by counting regiments or battalions. Its effectiveness depends on how well it plugs into the broader Marine and joint warfighting system. That integration gives the Corps its distinctive operational character. But it also raises another issue. These divisions do not all play the same role over time. Some have remained central to modern force posture, while others were created for past wars and later disappeared, leaving behind a historical legacy that still shapes Marine identity today. Marine divisions are usually discussed as if they have always existed in their current form, but the historical record tells a more uneven story. Some divisions became permanent pillars of the Corps. Others were activated for major wars, performed specific roles, and were later deactivated when the strategic environment changed. To understand the full system, it is necessary to distinguish between the divisions that define today's force and the ones that belong to earlier periods of expansion. The most historically significant active formations are the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Marine Divisions, alongside the 4th Marine Division in the reserve component. These are the divisions most relevant to current U.S. military posture. They are tied to ongoing readiness requirements, standing command relationships, and real-world deployment frameworks. Their purpose is not commemorative. It is operational. They exist because the Marine Corps still requires them as functional parts of its expeditionary structure. But the Marine Corps has fielded additional divisions in wartime. During the Second World War, for example, the Corps expanded rapidly to meet the demands of large-scale amphibious operations across the Pacific. Formations such as the 5th and 6th Marine Divisions were organized for those conditions. They played important roles in campaigns that required far more manpower and assault capacity than the peacetime Corps would normally sustain. Once the war ended and the strategic requirement contracted, those divisions were deactivated rather than maintained indefinitely. That pattern reveals something important about Marine Force design. Divisions are not preserved simply for symbolism or institutional prestige. They are maintained when there is a continuing requirement for them, and they disappear when that requirement fades. In other words, the number of Marine divisions has always reflected the scale of U.S. commitments, the expected character of war, and the resources the nation was willing to assign to expeditionary ground combat. Even so, the legacy of former divisions still shapes the Corps. Their campaign histories, battle honors, and organizational lessons remain embedded in Marine institutional memory. They help explain how today's divisions think about identity, readiness, and operational expectations. But history alone does not explain the current force. The next question is how modern divisions are adapting to new strategic priorities, especially as the Corps shifts away from older assumptions and prepares for a different kind of conflict environment. The modern Marine Division is not standing still. It is being reshaped by a broader transformation inside the Marine Corps, one driven by the expectation that future conflict may look less like prolonged land campaigns and more like fast-moving, geographically dispersed competition across contested maritime regions. To understand Marine divisions today, it is necessary to look at adaptation. What is changing, what is being reduced, and what capabilities are being emphasized instead. For years, Marine divisions were heavily associated with large ground operations in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Those wars required sustained land presence, convoy security, urban combat, and long-duration support structures. But more recent planning has pushed the Corps toward a different model, especially one centered on the Indo-Pacific. That shift places greater importance on mobility, smaller distributed formations, maritime coordination, precision fires, and the ability to operate inside contested spaces without relying on large fixed bases. This does not make the division irrelevant. It changes how the division is expected to contribute. Instead of assuming that every problem will be solved by massing large formations inland, the Corps has placed growing emphasis on how ground units support naval campaigns, control key terrain, enable sensing and targeting, and create uncertainty for an adversary across island chains and littoral zones. In that environment, some traditional assumptions about armor, force concentration, and sustainment have been reconsidered. The 3rd Marine Division's Indo-Pacific orientation is especially important here because it reflects the region most central to this new strategic logic. Forward posture, interoperability with allies, and operations across dispersed geography all become more consequential under this model. At the same time, the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions still provide depth, readiness, and scalable combat power for crises beyond a single theater. The Reserve Division continues to matter as expansion capacity if a contingency grows larger than the active structure can absorb alone. In other words, Marine divisions are not disappearing. They are being recalibrated to fit a changing operational environment. Their future role depends less on repeating past templates and more on integrating with a force designed for speed, maritime relevance, and distributed operations. And that leads to the final question. When all these layers are put together, What is the Marine Division's real strategic role inside the larger American military system? When all the layers are stripped back, the Marine Division's real role is not to dominate every kind of war. It is to give the United States a fast, organized, expeditionary ground force that can arrive early, integrate quickly, and operate as part of a larger naval and joint system. That is the strategic logic connecting all Marine divisions, whether active or reserve, historical or current. They exist to provide credible ground combat power at the point where mobility, readiness, and integration matter most. This makes the division a bridge between political decision and military action. National leaders may need a force that can respond before a larger campaign has fully formed, reassure allies without building a massive footprint, or establish a combat presence in a region where time is limited and infrastructure is uncertain. A Marine division, especially when tied into a Marine expeditionary force, helps fill that gap. It offers something larger and more durable than a small crisis response package, but faster and more expeditionary than a slower heavy force buildup. That role also explains why Marine divisions remain tied so closely to ships, aviation, logistics, and forward posture. Their value is not just what they can do after arrival. It is how quickly they can become useful in unstable conditions. In strategic terms, they are designed to create options. They can reinforce deterrence, support regional commanders, open access for follow-on forces, or impose costs in the early phases of a contingency before the full weight of the broader U.S. military arrives. The reserve dimension sharpens this further. The active divisions provide immediate availability, while the reserve division provides the ability to expand once an emergency becomes a longer campaign. That creates a layered force model. Respond first, stabilize quickly, then reinforce if necessary. It is a smaller structure than the Army's, but it is built around speed, adaptability, and institutional readiness rather than sheer mass. So the Marine Division is best understood as an operational instrument of controlled escalation. It gives the United States a way to project disciplined ground combat power without waiting for the slow assembly of a much larger war machine. But that role is now under pressure from changing technology, distance, and the demands of future conflict. And that is where the broader strategic reality comes into focus. The strategic reality of Marine divisions is more restrained and more revealing than their public image suggests. They are not standalone armies, and they are not relics preserved only for tradition. They are modular ground combat formations inside a larger expeditionary design built to convert readiness into usable force under tight timelines. Their importance comes from how they fit into the American military system, not as the biggest formations available, but as some of the fastest organized combat power the United States can position and sustain in uncertain conditions. That is why their structure matters so much. The active divisions provide permanent, high-readiness capability tied to major Marine expeditionary forces. The Reserve Division provides expansion capacity when a limited crisis becomes a larger war. Their headquarters translate strategy into executable orders. Their regiments and battalions provide maneuver. Their artillery, reconnaissance, engineers, and communications elements turn manpower into coordinated combat effect. Their logistics links make sure the force can keep operating after the first movement or first engagement. None of these layers is optional. Each one exists because expeditionary warfare punishes incomplete systems. The future challenge is that the environment around them is changing faster than the institutional concept itself. Precision strike systems, contested sea lanes, longer supply lines, distributed maritime operations, and the growing centrality of the Indo-Pacific all force Marine divisions to become lighter in some ways and more networked in others. They still need mass where mass is required, but they also need to operate in smaller, more dispersed patterns without losing command coherence or sustainment. That is a difficult balance, and it is now central to Marine Corps planning. So the real story of every U.S. Marine division is not just one of battlefield legacy, it is one of adaptation. These formations began as instruments of expeditionary assault, matured into standing pillars of rapid response combat power, and are now being reworked for a strategic era defined by distance, speed, and contested access. In that sense, the Marine Division remains what it has always been at its core, not simply a collection of troops, but a carefully structured mechanism for projecting the American military power where reaction time and operational integration matter most.